The capsule landed perfectly. Its parachutes opened exactly on schedule. The recovery helicopters circled overhead as Soviet ground crews rushed across the Kazakh steppe toward the small, scorched spacecraft resting silently in the grass. Everything appeared normal. Inside were 3 Soviet cosmonauts, returning from humanity's first successful mission aboard a space station. The mission had been a triumph. The men inside were heroes. But when rescuers opened the hatch, all 3 were dead. No explosion, no fire, no collision with a meteor. Just silence. To this day, they remain the only humans in history to die in space itself. This is the story of Soyuz 11 disaster, and how a tiny valve, no larger than a coin, turned one of humanity's greatest achievements into one of the most horrifying deaths ever recorded. By 1971, the space race had already transformed the world. For more than a decade, the Soviet Union and the United States had battled for dominance beyond Earth's atmosphere. The Soviets achieved many of the early victories: first satellite, first animal in orbit, first man in space, first woman in space. But in July of 1969, the Americans achieved the one milestone that overshadowed everything else: the moon landing. The Soviet space program had suffered humiliating setbacks trying to compete with Apollo. Their giant N-1 moon rocket exploded repeatedly. Cosmonauts had already died in earlier missions, and behind closed doors, Soviet leadership desperately needed a victory. So instead of racing to the moon, they pivoted towards something new: space stations, permanent human presence in orbit. If America would conquer the moon, the Soviet Union would conquer space itself. In April 1971, the USSR launched Salyut 1, the first space station in human history. It was a massive achievement, a laboratory floating hundreds of kilometers above Earth, a place where humans could live in orbit for weeks at a time. But there was a problem. The first crew sent aboard Salyut 1 failed to dock properly and had to abort the mission. The station was now empty. Time was running out, and Soviet leadership demanded success. The next mission would be called Soyuz 11. 3 men were selected: Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev. None of them was supposed to fly. Just days before launch, the original prime crew was removed after one cosmonaut was suspected of having tuberculosis. The backup crew suddenly became the main crew, a last-minute change that unknowingly sealed their fate. Dobrovolsky was calm and disciplined. Volkov was experienced and technically brilliant. Patsayev was an engineer with a deep passion for astronomy. Together, they carried the pressure of an entire nation. On June 6, 1971, Soyuz 11 launched successfully from Baikonur Cosmodrome. The rocket thundered into the sky. Within minutes, the crew was in orbit. Then came the critical moment: docking with Salyut 1. Unlike modern spacecraft, docking in the early 1970s was incredibly dangerous. One mistake could destroy both vehicles instantly. But Soyuz 11 succeeded. For the first time in history, human beings entered a space station. Inside Salyut 1, the crew began living an entirely new kind of human existence. Not explorers briefly visiting space, but people living there. The station was cramped, hot, uncomfortable. Electrical systems malfunctioned constantly. The air sometimes smelled like burning metal. But despite the problems, the mission became a major success. The crew conducted scientific experiments, observed Earth, studied human adaptation to long-duration spaceflight, and set new endurance records. For 23 days, they orbited Earth again and again and again. 16 sunrises every day, 16 sunsets every night. Far below them, the world continued normally. People went to work, children played outside, cars moved through city streets. And above all of it, 3 men floated silently through the darkness of orbit, completely separated from Earth by a thin layer of metal. Eventually, however, conditions aboard Salyut 1 worsened. A fire scare filled the station with smoke. Systems became unreliable. The mission was cut short. It was finally time to come home. On June 29, 1971, the crew boarded their Soyuz capsule and undocked from Salyut 1. Everything appeared normal. The deorbit burn was successful. The spacecraft began descending toward Earth. Then, at an altitude of roughly 168 kilometers above Earth, disaster struck. A pressure equalization valve suddenly opened inside the spacecraft. The valve was designed to automatically equalize cabin pressure after landing. But somehow, during module separation, it opened early. The opening was tiny, only about the size of a pencil. But in the vacuum of space, that was enough. Air began exploding out of the capsule violently. Within seconds, cabin pressure started collapsing. The crew had no idea what was happening. Warning alarms activated instantly. The men scrambled desperately through the tiny cabin, trying to locate the leak. But there was another problem. They weren't wearing pressure suits. The Soyuz capsule was too cramped for 3 suited cosmonauts. So Soviet engineers made a compromise. The crew would fly in simple flight overalls instead. If cabin pressure failed, there would be nothing protecting them. Inside the capsule, the pressure dropped catastrophically. Human beings cannot survive exposure to vacuum. The oxygen inside the bloodstream begins to collapse. Moisture on the tongue and eyes starts to boil. The body swells. Consciousness fades rapidly. Investigators later determined the crew likely remained conscious for less than 1 minute. But in those final seconds, they fought to survive. Evidence showed the crew actually located the valve. One of the cosmonauts had tried manually closing it. Fingernail marks were found near the mechanism. They were incredibly close, just seconds away from saving themselves. But they lost consciousness before they could seal the leak completely. Inside the capsule, silence took over. The spacecraft continued descending automatically toward Earth. 3 dead men strapped into their seats. From the ground, nothing looked wrong. The parachutes deployed normally. Recovery teams tracked the capsule descending across Kazakhstan. Helicopters approached the landing site. Soviet personnel rushed toward the spacecraft smiling, expecting a celebration. The hatch was opened. At first, the crew appeared unconscious. Then, rescuers realized something horrifying. None of the men were breathing. Doctors pulled the cosmonauts from the capsule and attempted CPR immediately, but it was already over. The official Soviet report later concluded the crew had died from depressurization and suffocation. The first humans to ever live aboard a space station had become the first humans to die in space. The deaths of the Soyuz 11 crew shocked the Soviet space program, but much of the truth was hidden from the public. In classic Soviet fashion, details remained secretive for years. The government celebrated the cosmonauts as heroes, which they were, but behind the scenes, engineers understood the terrifying reality. Space is unbelievably hostile, and survival depends entirely on engineering working perfectly. One tiny failed component had killed 3 experienced cosmonauts in less than a minute. After the disaster, Soviet spacecraft were redesigned. Future Soyuz crews would wear pressure suits during launch and re-entry. That rule remains in place today. The tragedy permanently changed human spaceflight safety. And remarkably, the Soyuz spacecraft, heavily modified over time, is still used more than 50 years later. There's something uniquely terrifying about the deaths aboard Soyuz 11. Most space disasters are violent, explosive, chaotic. But this one was quiet. No fireball crossing the sky, no debris raining into the ocean, just 3 men suffocating silently while orbiting above Earth, unable to reach help, unable to escape. The vacuum of space is difficult to truly comprehend. On Earth, air is everywhere, pressure is everywhere. We never think about it. But in space, life survives inside tiny artificial bubbles. A spacecraft is not really a ship. It's a fragile pocket of Earth moving through an environment completely incompatible with human existence. And Soyuz 11 exposed that reality in the most brutal way imaginable. Today, Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev are remembered not just for how they died, but for the courage it took to go. They ventured into the unknown at a time when every mission carried enormous risk. And because of men like them, humanity learned how to live beyond Earth. May they rest peacefully among the stars they gave their lives to reaching, and may they never be forgotten.